Israel, 2001. The elusive quest for peace continues in the Holy Land. This Holy Land represents a religious and a socio-political center for millions of faithful worldwide. In the 4,000 years since Abraham walked this land, his Jewish and Arab descendants have not stopped fighting over it. Today, with the communication age upon us, the issues are as intense now as they were thousands of years ago. In this program, we introduce you to a topic that has become essential for your intercessory prayer. Victor Mordechai, a respected Israeli who has made it his life work to study and expose the true world of Islam and Muslim fundamentalism, offers you compelling proof that Jews and Christians worldwide could be sacrificed for a barrel of oil. The only answer, therefore, for Israel, America, and the world is a Christian revival for Israel's survival.
One of the reasons I came to the realization that the Christians need to have a revival for Israel's survival is because that the American people, like many, many nations on earth, which are supposedly Christian nations, are basically divided into two groups. You've got the Christians who love God, love the Bible, love Israel, and then you've got the others who are nominally Christians, but they love one thing, and that's money. They love money, they love petroleum, they love power. And when I was in Dallas in 1991, I had the experience of my life. I was invited to speak before the Dallas Council on World Affairs in April of 1991. The Dallas Council on World Affairs is part of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. This is not a Christian church group, believe me. This is an economic group, and the purposes of this group are to make sure that the international globalist agenda is protected and maintained. And any group or any religion that comes in the way of the money and the petroleum will be trounced upon and destroyed. And I said to them, you know, Israel has a certain bottom line. The bottom line is we must keep the Jordan River as our security border, we must keep the Golan Heights, and we must keep Gaza. Any movement away from those borders will be equal to the Dutch boy pulling his finger out of the dike. Israel will not be able to defend itself if Israel moves from those borders. We agree that the Palestinians should be able to lead their own lives and live in peace alongside the Israelis. But we do not agree that a constant war or intifada should be waged against the Israelis, and especially because Israel has given the Arab side 97% of the land. And Ehud Barak has offered 98.5% of the land. And Arafat's answer was war and intifada in September of the year 2000, continuing to this day and escalating on this day. And I explained to them about UN resolutions 242 and 338. That these UN resolutions say, yes, Israel must give land, but yes, Israel must have new borders which are secure, recognized, and defensible. And I explained that these borders that I've been talking about, the Jordan River, the Golan Heights, or half the Golan Heights, Gaza Strip border with Egypt, these are the security borders which Israel must maintain in order to survive. After I spoke, there was questions and answers. And they said to me that you, Victor Mordechai, do not understand realities. Reality number one is that Israel is all alone. The United States is not an ally of Israel anymore. That's reality number one. The United States gave Israel an airlift in 1973. Well, America will never give Israel an airlift again. We don't care, they said to me. We don't care about UN resolutions 242 and 338. Israel will return to the 67 borders, and Israel will hand over East Jerusalem to the Palestinians because Israel is all alone and America is not your ally or friend anymore. This is the first reality. And don't forget, this is April 1991 under George Bush the father administration. The second reality, they said to me, is that there's only one thing that made America great, and that's the barrel of oil, the steady price of oil and the steady supply of oil, and we're not going to let the Jews get in the way of that. And what happened immediately after this changed my life forever. A very dear Christian, fundamentalist, Bible-believing Christian, got up and said to these people in the room, who supposedly, nominally are Christians also, and I was the only Jew, the only Israeli in the room, and this Christian man got up and said, you say that what made America great was the barrel of oil, the steady price of oil, the steady supply of oil? You call yourselves Christians? You should be ashamed of yourselves. What made America great was not the barrel of oil. What made America great was Jesus Christ. Now, I am a Jew. I'm not a Christian. But that night changed my perspective on many, many things. I used to hate the cross, and I used to hate the Christians, and I used to hate the churches as a young man. And all of a sudden I realized that the Christians, especially those who were with me that night, the Christians who were standing by me and standing by Israel, these Christians were not Israel's best friends. These Christians were Israel's only friends. My answer to these people in the Dallas Council was, you know, in World War II, Hitler killed 6 million Jews. But Hitler was not entirely alone. The Arabs had the oil, the Arabs had the power, and in 1930s and 40s, the Arab petrodollar strength was used to extort concessions from the British and from the Americans. The white papers were issued by the British government. Jews were not allowed to emigrate to Palestine from Nazi-occupied Europe. Jews were not allowed to leave Nazi Europe to go to England, to go to America, to go to Cuba, to go to Mexico, Dominican Republic, or anywhere. And indeed, there was a refugee ship in May of 1939 that left the port of Hamburg. It was carrying over 800 Jewish refugees with valid visas, with valid passports to Cuba. And Breckinridge Long, who was the Undersecretary of State in the 30s and 40s, in charge of visas, made sure to it that America's doors were hermetically sealed. Breckinridge Long forced the Cuban government to cancel the validity of those visas. And those 800 Jews on that refugee ship were sent back to their deaths in Nazi-occupied Europe. So Hitler was not alone. Hitler had allies, such as Roosevelt, Churchill, and Breckinridge Long. And the main group behind Hitler were the Muslims, the Palestinians, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem. All these people sought one thing, and that was to destroy the Jews. Towards the end of World War II, the one railroad track to Auschwitz could have and should have been bombed by either a Lancaster British bomber or a B-17. If you had bombed that railroad track once a week, 2 or 3 million Jews could have been saved from the gas chambers. Just disrupt the schedule of Adolf Eichmann, and yet this was not done. And here I was in April of 1991 being told by the Dallas Council on World Affairs that Israel would not come in the way of oil supplies, that Israel would be sacrificed for a barrel of oil again. And my answer to these people was, over my dead body. And this is the reason why I, as a Jewish person, am going to the Christians in churches all over the world and trying to stir up a Christian revival for Israel's survival. Because the Jews, with all due respect, 5 million in Israel and 5 million in America, cannot alone withstand not only the over a billion Muslims in the world, but to withstand the allies, who are the globalist bankers, corporation, bank people, the people who are funded by Islam, and are killing the black people in the Sudan in the millions, and killing Christians in Indonesia, and killing Christians everywhere in the world, and yet nobody says anything because the Islamic petrodollar is king. And today the Christians of the world have to answer one question. Are they loyal to God, or are they loyal to a globalist international system that would sacrifice Israel for a barrel of oil? And this is why it's important to wage the battle for a Christian revival in the churches, a Christian revival for Israel's survival. Indeed, many people consider terrorism a bad thing. Of course, if it's carried out against the World Trade Center in New York City, or against the Pentagon in Washington, or against the USS Cole in Yemen, or against the American embassies in Africa, or terrorism that takes place anywhere in the world outside of Israel. Because, of course, there's something known in our history in Israel as the double standard. The double standard meaning that terrorism in Israel is legitimate, killing Israelis is legitimate, but of course terrorism in America is not legitimate and killing Americans is not legitimate. Israel has had to face this situation for over 52 years. Today America is targeting Osama bin Laden and the Taliban regime, which is hiding him. And yet when Israel comes to the world and says that the PFLP, which killed our minister, Rechavam Ze'evi, these people who killed Rechavam Ze'evi of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Israel has declared total war on the PFLP and those who shelter them. In this case, Yasser Arafat is our equivalent of the Taliban regime. Unfortunately, the United States is trying to build an alliance with the Islamic countries, supposedly to deal with terrorism. In other words, it's trying, like America trying to make an alliance with terrorists in order to deal with terrorists. It's kind of like coming to the mafia and say, we want to fight the mafia. Give us John Gotti. So it's like trying to make a deal with the terrorists to deal with the terrorists. It's not going to work. I also believe that there will be a domino situation in which countries will fall to radical Islam as a result of massive demonstrations, revolutions, disturbances. Pakistan is one country which easily can be falling over to the Islamic rule. Saudi Arabia already is a radically Islamic country against the United States. Many people ask, what is happening regarding the question of nuclear weapons? And indeed, Osama bin Laden has been caught red-handed trying to import from the former Soviet Union shipments of uranium-235 and strontium-90 for the creation not only of nuclear weapons, but the kind of weapons that can spread fallout. Because, of course, strontium-90, you cannot make an atomic bomb, but you can spread the biochemical terrorism of nuclear contamination, which also kills. Iraq, and especially Iran, have been spending a lot of money to develop a nuclear capability. Iran, within 2 to 3 years, will have that nuclear missile capability to hit Israel and even Europe. So Iran must be dealt with. Iraq must be dealt with. Syria must be dealt with. Saudi Arabia must be dealt with. All these countries are allied in their hatred of the Christians and their hatred of the Jews. And I'm sorry for the very poor, miserable people who make trillions of dollars in oil imports and arms exports to the Middle East. But these people who are also in control of the agenda and the media, these people are denying the common people like you and me in America and in Europe and throughout the world of the truth. We have been denied the information about what is the truth of the Islamic plans, what is the role that Saudi Arabia plays, what is the role that Iran, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, Palestinians, Egyptians, what they all play, the role they play in the common war of Islam against the Jews and the Christians. And of course, they blame the Jews and the Christians for waging a war on Islam. All the Jews and the Christians want is to make money and to live well. Saudi Arabia is a country not very much different than the Taliban of Afghanistan. And indeed, in Saudi Arabia, there is a very great hatred for the Christians. And of course, Jews are not allowed even to step on Saudi soil. The Saudis also do not allow women to drive cars, which is kind of like Afghanistan. Women really cannot move about freely in the streets of Saudi Arabia without a male escort of their family, like in Afghanistan. So women in Saudi Arabia are not to be seen or heard. They are kept hidden away, and of course, when they do go out, they must cover themselves up completely, like in Afghanistan. So first, let's set the record straight. Saudi Arabia is a fanatic Islamic state. Saudi Arabia, together with the United States, funded the training of Osama bin Laden during the war against the Soviets. Saudi Arabia has been funding the spread of Islam everywhere in the world. Saudi Arabia has been spending tremendous amounts of money for terrorist Islamic organizations all over the world. Saudi Arabia made an agreement with these terrorist organizations that it's okay for you and we will fund you if you do your terrorist things in every other country of the world, in Israel, in America, in Europe, everywhere in the world. Just don't allow this terrorism on Saudi soil. This was the agreement between the Saudi authorities and the Islamic fanatics who have been carrying out a lot of the terrorism around the world, including in Yemen with the attack on the USS Cole, in Africa with the destruction of the 2 American embassies, and in many other attacks. And in fact, just recently, the Saudis funded a very important meeting of Islamic radicals in Denmark, in Europe, and that this was funded by the Saudis. The most fanatic radical Muslims are being funded by the Saudis even to this day. Another very important point that must be stressed. Saudi Arabia is not a country that lives only by itself. Saudi Arabia is part of a broad coalition of Islamic states, including Syria, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Indonesia, and these Islamic fanatics are spread throughout all of these Islamic countries. To say that by taking out Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda terrorist movement, you have finished with the terrorism, is absolutely fallacious. And if tomorrow Osama bin Laden is apprehended and taken to the War Crimes Tribunal in the Netherlands, or if he is killed, and if even the Taliban government of Afghanistan is removed from power, do you honestly believe that the terrorism will stop? Do you honestly believe that the anthrax, the smallpox, the biochemical terrorism will stop? Do you believe that American and foreign airliners will not be shot at? That there will not be terrorism in the streets of America and Europe and other countries? These Islamic groups have been sent and they've been paid for by Saudi Arabia, by Iraq, by Syria, by Iran, and their agenda is the destruction of the Judeo-Christian West. This is a political and a religious agenda as one. And unfortunately, Christians in America, Christians in Europe, have a very, very small understanding of this. The Islamic motto is kill the Jews on Saturday and kill the Christians on Sunday, because the Jews and the Christians, in the eyes of Islam, are one people. We are the people of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are the people of the Bible. And the Messiah for the Jews and the Christians is a Jew who speaks Hebrew. And this is something Islam cannot tolerate. On the day of judgment, all the Jews and all the Christians will be killed by Jesus the Muslim. So their Jesus is a different Jesus. But this is the day of judgment that the Jew, the Christian, and the Muslim are anxiously expecting. There are some people who say to themselves, oh, if only the Jews would just give the Arabs what they wanted. If the Israelis would just give the Arabs the land, Judea, Samaria, Gaza, the Golan, go back to the 67 borders, everything would just be fine. And very unfortunately, we have proven, Israel has proven that for peace, Israel is ready to do anything. Israel was attacked many times, 6 times in the last 50 years. And in wars of self-defense, Israel took lands. And the world forced Israel to give back half the Golan, to give back Sinai, that's 93% of the land. Since the peace agreement with Jordan, since the peace agreements known, quote unquote, the peace agreements of Oslo I, Oslo II, Israel has given Jordan and the Palestinian autonomy more land. Israel has already returned to the Arab side 97% of the lands that Israel was forced to take in wars of self-defense. Now, you know, UN resolutions 242 and 338 call for Israel to give land for peace, okay? And Israel will negotiate for new borders which are secure, recognized, and defensible. Nowhere in UN resolutions 242 and 338 did it say that Israel had to go back to the 67 borders and return Jerusalem to the Arab side. Nowhere does it say this. So basically, Israel has already given 97% of the land to the Arab side. What we're talking about now is the remaining 3%. Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister of the State of Israel, at the Camp David Accords, or Camp David negotiations of June of the year 2000, promised Arafat 98.5% of the lands that Israel was forced to take in wars of self-defense. And Arafat, not only did he say no, but Arafat came back to us with a war known as the Al-Quds Intifada, which started in September a year ago of the year 2000. And now, today, on the 19th of October, we see a war developing in the territories, a war that was not started by the Israelis. Like I said before, Ehud Barak promised the Arabs 98.5%, and that was not good enough. What did Yasser Arafat say immediately after Ehud Barak promised him 98.5%? He said, no, we want 100%, which of course means that the Arabs reject UN resolutions 242 and 338. They never accepted UN resolutions 242 and 338. What we see here is a great deception of the world by the Arab side that they have accepted the UN resolutions. They have not. The Arabs have always said that they want a return to the 67 borders and Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, being in their hands. So firstly, it has to be made very clear that Israel must go entirely back to the 67 borders for the United States to be happy. But the Arabs still will not be happy. Why? Because Yasser Arafat is now saying, what about Resolution 194, going back to 1947, that Israel should not only not stay at the 67 borders, Israel should go back to the partition plan of 1947, which would give them back Ramleh, Lud, Akko, Yaffo, Nazareth, Jerusalem. In other words, that Israel should go back to the borders of 47. This man, Yasser Arafat, is living in the 1001 Nights dream world of Islamic fantasy. The next thing he said is that 5-6 million Palestinians from all over the world should be given the right to return, which would swamp Israel with an Islamic population, which basically means that Israel is committing suicide. And so the leadership of America, the leadership of Europe, needs to think very seriously about the role that these leaderships played in World War II. Because Hitler was not alone in killing the Jews. The English and the Americans, who were extorted by the Arabs for the petroleum, killed 6 million Jews by not allowing them to come back to Israel, and they're ready to do it all over again, that Israel will be sacrificed for a barrel of oil. Forcing Israel to withdraw from the Jordan River as a natural border, the Golan Heights as a strategic mountain area, and of course, Gaza means that Israel is like the Dutch boy pulling his finger out of the dike. Israel cannot move from the Jordan River and will not. Israel cannot withdraw from the half of the Golan Heights that it has. Israel cannot withdraw from Gaza. The borders we have now are the borders we must have, the minimum borders we must have for our survival. The Likud and the Labour parties, the majority of the Israeli people believe that the Arabs, the Palestinians, should have autonomy, that they should have a right to run their own lives. And we have done everything we could to help the Palestinians to prosper. And it was only after Arafat went berserk in September of the year 2000, when he started his intifada in the year 2000 in September, the Palestinians were living very well. The unemployment rate of the Palestinians was on par with the Israeli unemployment rate. In other words, the Palestinian autonomy and the Israeli economies were doing very well up to the time when Yasser Arafat went crazy, which was over a year ago. And since then, hundreds of Palestinians, unfortunately, and hundreds of Israelis, unfortunately, have been killed by the terror instigated by Yasser Arafat. So there is no way that the Palestinians will be satisfied, even if Israel, God forbid, were returned to the borders of 67. Because now, when Israel goes back to the borders of 67, they will want the borders of 47, and they will want the Palestinian refugees to come back to Israel, and swamp Israel with an Islamic population, which will overwhelm Israel and terminate Israel. Very, very important to stress, and I, of course, have written 2 books, but there's another book that I recommend very much, written by a Harvard professor, Professor Samuel Huntington, called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. And there, Samuel Huntington explains that within the next 50 years, America and the Christian West will lose the primacy of the world, that the Judeo-Christian Western civilization is sinking and will be eclipsed by the 3 pagan Eastern systems of Mandarin China, Hindu India, and Islam, which of course these are 3 pagan systems, which are out to replace the Judeo-Christian West. What we are facing now here in Jerusalem and in Bethlehem and in every city of the Middle East is a war between Islam and the Judeo-Christian West. We see this happening now in Europe. We see, for example, an invasion of Europe, an invasion of America, of South America, of Africa, by Islamic demographic groups, where Austria today is 20% Muslim, and within 50 years, at the present given rate, Austria will be an Islamic country, and German will not be the language of Austria anymore if things continue like this. Germany to a lesser extent. France, England, Holland, Spain, Italy, all these countries are facing growing Islamic populations. Very, very slow, quiet, evolutionary Islamic people who are not violent people necessarily, but they do believe that Islam will win. So we see here one phenomena, and this phenomenon here is the war between Israel and the Islamic side. It's not only the Palestinians, not only the Arabs, it's the Iranians, it's the Pakistanis, it's other Islamic groups that are allied with Islam. The Bible teaches us a very clear lesson. The Jews are the apple of God's eyes, and anybody who goes against the Jews and tries to pluck out the apple of God's eye is going to get both his eyes plucked out. And this happened to Pharaoh. This happened to Haman, if you remember the scroll of Esther. This happened to Hitler. And by the way, I would have never said this years ago. I mourn today for the 20 million Germans who died in World War II. Because the Germans, many of them did not know. The Germans, many of them were good people. We are all created in the image of God. I mourn for the individuals. But the Nazi system deceived and destroyed the German people. The communist system deceived and destroyed the Russian people. And now Islam is a system which is deceiving and destroying the Muslims. And like I said before, Allah is Satan. He wants to see the Jews dead because the Jews gave the Bible to the world, which is God's word. Satan wants to see the Christians dead because the Christians are preaching the Bible to the world. And Satan wants to see the Muslims dead because the Muslims are created in the image of God, just like the Jews and the Christians. We should not hate the Muslims. We should love the Muslims. And we should help them to be delivered and freed of the bondage of the Islamic system, just as the Germans were freed from the bondage of the Nazi system, just as the Russians were freed from the communist system, and just as the Afghanis should be freed from the Taliban system.